Becoming a new parent is difficult enough, but adding the financial stress of having and caring for a baby can make it much worse. So here in this video, I'll cover as much as I possibly can about changes in your insurance, in your savings accounts, budgeting, and we'll even go over some long-term wealth building strategies that you could maybe use for your children as well. First, let me introduce myself. My name is Noah, and I am a financial planner primarily for business owners and self-employed folks. A few years ago, after having my first child, I realized how little information there was on the internet from actually qualified financial planners and not just well-intentioned parents sharing their experiences, which is still good. So that's what brings me here today. So first, let's talk about some things to think about before you even get pregnant. Now, if you're watching this video, it's probably a little late for that, but that's okay. Some of these things you can still do. So first, let's talk about baseline budgeting. You'll want to do some things now before the child actually arrives in order to set yourself up well for planning in the future. You'll want to have some idea of what your baseline expenses are. What I mean by this is each month, what do your normal expenses come out to be, roughly? The reason you want to do this now before you're even pregnant is because during pregnancy, there are a lot of costs that will happen that are not normal expenses and actually won't even be normal once the child arrives. So, for example, when my wife was pregnant, our food consumption as a household increased only a little bit. However, because of recurring nausea, she was unable to cook food for the first 2 trimesters. This means that we ordered food almost daily. Since having children, we hardly ever eat out at all, maybe once a week. So as far as our monthly expenses go, pregnancy was extremely high as far as food and groceries go, and it's actually been lower since then and before then. So looking at our budget during pregnancy would not have been very helpful at all. We'll revisit budgeting in a minute, but let's talk about another pre-pregnancy component, health insurance. If you have access to health insurance through your workplace, there are 2 likely options that you have access to, a PPO or an HMO. I will try to simply explain these differences in a way that's relevant. When you are single or married without children, PPOs often make more sense. The reason is that the premiums are lower than an HMO and you aren't bound to a certain network. The trade-off is that you have a much higher deductible. So if you do go see a doctor or a specialist, your out-of-pocket costs tend to be a lot higher. But single and married folks without children rarely do this unless there's some other pre-existing medical condition. So when people do have children, many people switch to HMOs instead. The reason is that even though the network tends to be more restrictive as far as who and who isn't covered, usually those within your network are extremely cheap if not completely covered. And your overall deductible will usually be lower. Since you are making more frequent doctor's visits when you have children in your house, both when they're in the newborn and baby stage as well as when they get older, having a lower deductible is usually more of a priority in order to have overall cost savings. If you don't have a workplace health plan, either because you're self-employed or it's not included or whatever the cause might be, either you can go and purchase your own from the healthcare marketplace, or you can participate in a Medi-Share type plan. Medi-Share plans can be nice because of the flexibility and there is some savings options as well, but it's important to remember that they are not health insurance companies and they are not regulated as health insurance companies. So it's important to keep that in mind. Now, the cost of actually delivering a child is going to vary depending on a ton of things. But depending on your insurance situation, you might be left with a pretty large bill. This is why if you're going to opt for a cheaper health insurance plan, you absolutely need to be putting money away into savings. That said, if you are in extreme financial disarray, no steady income, nothing in the bank, whatever it might be, there are both payment plans and financial assistance plans for situations like that if you were to get handed an $11,000 bill, like I was. So all of this is stuff that happens before a baby is born, but what happens after? Well, you've probably seen those studies that say something to the effect of,
children on average cost $20,000 a year to raise,
or some other ridiculous number before they turn 18. These studies are not true, but there are certainly some choices that you can make that might start to bring those costs closer to something like $20,000 a year. Things like private schooling or travel sports or other things like that. But for the most part, studies like that don't mean anything. The other difficult part is that from this point forward, almost all expenses, while they exist in some way, shape, or form for everyone, are going to look different based on the choices of each parent. So, let me give you a couple of examples. Some families will choose cloth diapers over disposable diapers. These are usually much cheaper but take a lot of time and effort to clean and wash and reuse. Disposable diapers cost more, but you just throw them away and you're done. Some families will nurse for a very long time, and some will quickly move to baby formula. That also changes the costs month to month. Many families, especially these days, are choosing to forego some vaccines or opt for an alternative vaccine schedule, and that's also going to change the costs month to month, especially in those newborn phases, depending on your insurance situation. All of this is to say is there is no standard cost of raising a child. Rather, what you should do is as you make these decisions and you come to these junction points, make sure to tally what that's actually going to cost you roughly each month, and you can add it to that baseline budget that we talked about earlier. Your grocery bill might increase slightly, but probably nothing astronomical compared to some of the other options that we just talked about, at least not for the first couple of years. Alright, we've talked about health insurance and budgeting, but now let's talk about some bigger money decisions that may not fall in the day-to-day type things. First, life insurance. Now, if you are the breadwinner of your household, this is a non-negotiable. Term policies are extremely cheap, and you definitely want something in place if you have other people living under a roof that you have a mortgage on. And the same is true if both parents have income. But even if there is a stay-at-home spouse involved, you actually still want insurance on them. The reason is because if they were to pass away, you would still have several holes in the economy of the house. Someone needs to watch the children. More likely than not, no one is making meals at the house, at least not as much, so food is going to be more expensive. So while you probably don't need as much money as you would put in a life insurance policy on the breadwinner, it still would make sense to have a couple $100,000 on the stay-at-home spouse in case something bad were to happen. Again, term policies are extremely cheap, assuming that both people are in good health. If you are young and healthy, you can probably get term policies for both spouses for less than $150 or $200 a month, depending on what rates are when this video is released. Now, let's talk about saving money specifically for your child. There are a number of different ways to do this depending on how much money you want to save for them and what they're saving the money for. So first, let's talk about the most common, 529 plans. 529 plans allow somebody to contribute money on behalf of somebody else specifically for education. Any money that is withdrawn from the 529 is tax-free as long as it's used for qualified education expenses. And recently they made it possible that as long as the 529 is 15 years old, you can start to convert that to a Roth IRA. Now the cons for this is that if you wanted to do like a co-op or homeschool or something that isn't necessarily mainstream, it may not be considered a qualified education expense depending on your state. These rules are set at the state level, so legislatively, it may not offer you the most control to dictate how that money is spent, particularly if your child doesn't end up pursuing college. That's a 529, but you can also open a Uniform Transfers to Minor Act account or an UTMA account. UTMA accounts work exactly like a traditional brokerage account as far as taxes go. However, they are opened in the name of the child. When the child turns 18 or 21, depending on the state, the account immediately becomes theirs. The reason people do this is because it avoids any gift taxes if you were wanting to give your child a very large amount of money. However, there is a way that the control over this account is limited in the way that it's transferred. When a child reaches the age of majority, that account immediately becomes theirs with little to no exception. This means that if there's issues of addiction or substance abuse or something else like that, there aren't any safeguards in place to keep that maybe very large amount of money to immediately going into their name. For contrast, trusts, which is when someone passes away, can have clauses in there that would prevent assets being transferred if someone were to have substance abuse or addiction or something like that. That is not true for UTMA accounts. Now, I will give one last option in the way of an honorable mention, and that is permanent insurance policies. The issue here is that in almost every case, the amount of money that you'll actually have and that you'll actually be able to save will be significantly smaller than the other two accounts. However, the trade-off is control. This option provides the most amount of control over when the policy is transferred and how it's transferred to somebody else. In this case, the child would be the beneficiary and you would be the owner. And when you want them to have the money, you would make them the owner and the beneficiary. Now, like I said before, there are a lot of trade-offs here, and it really doesn't work at all like the other two accounts that we talked about. But it is an option if control over the assets is the thing that you are most concerned about. Something that you will also want to evaluate pre-pregnancy is your emergency fund. More likely than not, a couple does not need a very large emergency fund, especially if they don't have any kids, and especially if they are both working. However, that immediately changes when there's a child in the picture. So there are a couple of rules of thumb that people will follow. Some will say 3 to 6 months worth of expenses. Some people will say whatever your health insurance deductible is. Either of those two are good rules of thumb, but either way, your emergency fund needs to become bigger. And I've made a short video explaining where you can keep money like that, but more likely than not, it's going to be in a high yield savings account. This video is not meant to be a comprehensive guide to financial planning. Honestly, that's what people pay me for. But this is at least meant to put you in the right direction to start asking the right questions and to be able to prepare yourself for what's coming next. Even if you weren't to seek a lot of help outside this video, you would still be better prepared, and your child would most likely be better financially prepared in the future, more than most of your peers. So if you found this video helpful, leave something that you learned in the comments and subscribe for more content like this.